Teacher humiliates boy for his hat, but when he finds out who his father is, Richard Thompson was about to face the biggest regret of his 25-year career as an educator. With the same authority as always, Mr. Richard approached the desk of Noah, an 8-year-old boy who had transferred to the school just 2 weeks prior. The boy sat quietly, head down, hidden beneath a grey hat that blatantly contradicted the school's dress code. "You there, new kid? How many times do I have to repeat that we don't allow caps or hats in the classroom?" snapped Richard, his voice echoing off the walls of the silent room. Noah timidly raised his eyes without fully lifting his face and replied softly, "I'm sorry, sir, I can't take it off." A murmur spread through the classroom as the other students watched the scene unfold. The teacher, who had already warned the boy the day before, felt his face grow hot. Nothing irritated him more than having his authority challenged, especially in front of the entire class. "What do you mean, can't take it off?" Richard stepped closer, his voice rising. "In this school we follow rules that apply to everyone, no exceptions. If you're not willing to follow them, maybe this isn't the place for you." Noah clenched his trembling hands under the desk, gripping the edge of the polished wood as if searching for some kind of security. Sweat began to form on his forehead, partially hidden by the hat's brim. His eyes welled up as he tried to find words that would make the teacher understand without having to explain in front of everyone. "Please, sir, my dad said I could wear it." He attempted to argue, but was abruptly cut off. "Your father doesn't make the rules in my classroom." Richard was now right beside the boy's desk, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the small, shrinking body. "Take that hat off right now, or you'll have to leave." The seconds that followed felt like an eternity to everyone present. Noah remained frozen, his hands now gripping the sides of the hat tightly, as if it were his last refuge. Then, in an impulsive move that would later haunt him, the teacher yanked the hat off the boy's head. The silence that followed was deafening. The children stared wide-eyed at Noah, whose thin, uneven hair revealed visible patches on his scalp. The boy instantly covered his head with his hands, tears now streaming freely down his face as he sobbed uncontrollably. "Rules exist to be followed, no exceptions," Richard declared, maintaining his stern posture despite the discomfort creeping in. "Let this be a lesson to all of you." Holding the grey hat in one hand, he pointed to the door. "Go wait in the hallway until you learn to respect this institution's rules." Noah struggled to stand, shoulders hunched in shame, still trying to cover his head with his hands. As he passed the teacher, he reached a trembling hand toward the hat. After a moment's hesitation, Richard handed it back without looking directly at the boy, who clutched it to his chest as if it were his most precious possession. As Noah left the room, a palpable unease settled over the class. Some students exchanged horrified glances, while others kept their eyes fixed on their notebooks, unwilling to witness what had just happened. Richard tried to resume the lesson as if nothing had occurred, but even his own voice sounded strange to his ears. The morning passed with an unusual tension. During recess, Richard noticed the disapproving looks from some colleagues in the faculty lounge. He chose to ignore them. After all, he was just doing his job, maintaining the discipline that had always been his greatest pride as an educator. It was shortly after lunch when the principal's secretary appeared at his classroom door between lessons. "Mr. Richard, Principal Barbara would like to see you urgently in her office," the woman informed him, her tone unusually grave. "Now?" "I have a 5th grade class in 10 minutes, he protested, checking his watch. "The substitute teacher has already been called. The principal said it's a matter that can't wait." The walk to the principal's office had never felt so long. Richard tried to recall if he'd made any administrative mistakes, if any parents had complained about his strict grading, or if he was being called in for an emergency meeting. It never crossed his mind that the summons might be related to the incident with Noah. When he entered the principal's office, he found Barbara with a stern expression she rarely showed. Always composed and diplomatic, she now seemed genuinely troubled. "Sit down, Richard," she said, gesturing to the chair in front of her. "We have a delicate matter to discuss." "Did something happen?" he asked, perching on the edge of the chair, his back straight as always. "Yes, and I'm afraid." "It's quite serious," Barbara adjusted her glasses before continuing. I just received a call from the doctor of Noah Wilson, a second-grade student. Richard's heart skipped a beat. A doctor? He began connecting the dots in his mind, but the principal continued before he could articulate a thought. Noah has been undergoing treatment for 3 months. He has a temporary dermatological condition affecting his scalp, the result of a severe allergic reaction to medication. Barbara paused, as if carefully choosing her next words. The doctor emphasized that exposure could not only cause significant psychological distress, but also increase the risk of infection. Richard felt a lump form in his throat. The images from that morning came rushing back. The boy's ashamed face, the tears, the way he clutched his hat to his chest as he left the room. I wasn't informed about any of this, he defended himself, his voice losing its usual firmness. How could I have known? Actually, Richard, Barbara replied heavily, there's a note in the student's file. All teachers were notified by email when he enrolled 2 weeks ago. You signed off on the documentation. Richard's face burned with shame. He vaguely remembered receiving several emails about new students at the start of the semester, but with his workload, he hadn't paid proper attention to all of them. I don't recall reading that, he admitted finally, a growing unease settling in his chest. The boy's father is deeply upset. According to the doctor, Noah arrived at the clinic emotionally distraught after the incident. Barbara removed her glasses, rubbing her tired eyes. He's considering taking serious action against the school. Action? What kind of action? Richard's concern was evident. We don't know for certain yet. All I know is that he's coming to pick Noah up today and has requested a meeting tomorrow morning with you, me, and the school board. Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, trying to grasp the gravity of the situation. In his 25 years of teaching, he'd never faced anything like this. He had always been admired for his discipline, for maintaining control of his classes, for preparing students not just academically, but for life's challenges. I can speak to the boy. Today, apologize, he offered, searching for an immediate solution. I'm afraid it's too late for that. The doctor recommended Noah stay home for the rest of the week to recover from the emotional trauma. Barbara put her glasses back on. Besides, the father was very clear that he wants to resolve this formally. A heavy silence fell over the room. Through the principal's office window, Richard caught sight of the movement in the schoolyard. A black limousine had just parked, drawing his attention. A man in an impeccable suit stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting his tie as he walked toward the main entrance. Even from a distance, there was something strangely familiar about that figure. It's him, Barbara said, following the teacher's gaze. Noah's father. Who exactly is this man? Richard asked, a growing unease taking hold of him. The principal hesitated for a moment before answering. Michael Wilson, the new president of the Progress Educational Foundation, which just acquired our school last month. The name struck Richard like lightning. Michael Wilson. Could it be? After all these years? Do you know him? Barbara asked, noticing the change in the teacher's expression. I'm not sure, he replied, though a terrible certainty began forming in his mind. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Richard stayed in the principal's office for a few more minutes, discussing the next steps. It was decided that he would prepare a formal apology to present at the meeting the following day, when he'd have the chance to personally explain his mistake to Noah's father. Leaving the office, Richard took the long way to the teacher's lounge, avoiding the main yard, where he imagined Noah's father might still be. His heart raced as he tried to gather his thoughts. That name, Michael Wilson, echoed in his memory like a distant whisper from another time, another chapter of his life. That night, Richard barely slept. He tossed and turned, haunted by the day's images, Noah's ashamed face, the silent tears, the way he had clutched his hat to his chest. How could he have been so insensitive? How had he missed the signs? And above all, was it possible that this man, Michael Wilson, was who he suspected? The next morning, Richard arrived at school an hour earlier than usual. He wore his best suit, the one he reserved for graduations and special occasions. He mentally rehearsed his apology, practicing the words he would say, acknowledging his mistake, and assuring nothing like this would happen again. At exactly 8 o'clock, the secretary called him into the meeting room where the school board was already present, along with Principal Barbara. The atmosphere was tense, with hushed voices exchanging comments that stopped the moment he entered. Richard took his assigned seat, facing the door, and waited. 5 minutes later, the door opened and Michael Wilson walked in. Tall, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that surely cost more than 3 months of Richard's salary, he exuded a confidence that seemed to fill the room, yet his eyes held a calculated coldness that sent a chill down the teacher's spine. It was when their gazes met that Richard felt the full weight of reality. Those eyes, he knew them. He knew that face, now more mature but unmistakable. A flood of memories rushed through his mind. A scrawny boy of about 12, sitting in the back row of his very first class as a teacher, over 2 decades ago. A non-standard school hat, a public humiliation. A student who never returned to that school. Michael Wilson. The boy he had publicly humiliated in his first week as a teacher, snatching his hat in front of the whole class, exposing a condition much like the one his son now faced. "Mr. Thompson," said Michael, his voice controlled, but laden with restrained emotion, "it seems some lessons are never truly learned, are they?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as the businessman took his seat at the table, opening an elegant leather folder. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board, thank you all for being here this morning," Michael began, ignoring the shock on Richard's face. "We are here to discuss a serious incident that occurred yesterday involving my son Noah." With a precise gesture, he placed a tablet at the center of the table and tapped the screen. The video that began playing showed, from a side angle, the entire classroom scene. Richard approaching Noah's desk, the argument the moment he yanked the hat off the boy's head, the muffled laughter of some students, the child's uncontrollable sobbing. "This video was recorded on the phone of one of my son's classmates," Michael explained, watching the horrified expressions of the board members. "I received it yesterday afternoon, sent by concerned parents whose children came home traumatized." Am I what they had witnessed? Principal Barbara seemed to have aged 10 years as she watched the footage. Richard, meanwhile, could barely breathe. Seeing his own actions from that perspective, witnessing the cruelty of his behavior through the eyes of an observer, was devastating. When the video ended, Michael turned off the tablet and stared directly at the teacher. "This hat, Mr. Thompson," he said, pulling out a grey hat identical to Noah's from his folder, "was a gift from me to my son. I suggested he wear it to help him face his treatment, without feeling ashamed of his appearance, to give him confidence while enduring something no child should have to endure." The businessman placed the hat on the table in front of Richard, who stared at it as if it was something alien. "When I bought this hat for Noah, I told him a story about how when I was a boy, I also had to wear a similar hat." Michael paused meaningfully. "I told him there was a teacher who humiliated me for it, who tore my hat off in front of everyone, who made me feel less than human." Richard felt nauseous. The room seemed to spin around him as the full weight of the situation crashed down. The cycle had completed itself in the cruelest way possible. I told him it left a deep mark on me, but that the world had changed, that teachers today understood better, that they were more compassionate, more humane. Michael's voice trembled slightly. What irony to realize I was wrong, and that the same teacher who destroyed my confidence 25 years ago would find a way to do the same to my son. A heavy silence fell over the room. The board members looked from Michael to Richard, stunned by the revelation. "Mr. Wilson," the principal began, trying to regain some control, "we understand your outrage, and I assure you—" "With all due respect, Principal," Michael interrupted, raising a hand, "I didn't come here for assurances. I came here to make a decision about Mr. Thompson's future at this institution." Richard finally found his voice, though it sounded weak even to his own ears. "Mr. Wilson, there are no words to express my regret. I didn't recognize you until now, but now it's too late," Michael finished, his gaze unrelenting. 25 years later, And you still haven't learned that rules don't replace humanity." The words struck Richard like a physical blow. They were nearly the same words he had always used with his students, now turned against him, exposing the hypocrisy of his rigid stance. "I'd like to remind everyone that, as president of the foundation overseeing this school," Michael continued, addressing the board, "I have the authority to recommend the immediate dismissal of any staff member who violates the institution's core principles, and I believe publicly humiliating a vulnerable child certainly qualifies as such a violation." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Richard felt the ground crumble beneath him. 25 years of career, dedication, sacrifices, all about to end in the most humiliating way possible. "However," Michael went on to everyone's surprise, "my son asked me for something last night that made me reconsider." A glimmer of hope appeared on Richard's bleak horizon. "Noah asked me not to do to you what you did to him, not to humiliate you publicly, not to destroy your dignity." Michael adjusted his tie, a gesture that seemed to help him maintain composure. An 8-year-old boy showed more maturity and compassion than an educator with decades of experience. Richard lowered his head, unable to meet the man's gaze. The shame he felt was indescribable. "So," Michael concluded, "I won't demand your immediate dismissal, Mr. Thompson. Instead, I propose you be temporarily suspended while the board decides your future at this institution." Principal Barbara nodded solemnly. "I consider that a fair proposal, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Thompson will be relieved of his teaching duties starting today while we conduct an internal investigation and determine appropriate disciplinary measures." Richard remained silent, unable to protest or thank them for the unexpected mercy. He knew his career was irreparably tarnished, that his reputation would never fully recover. More than that, he knew he deserved every consequence of his actions. The meeting continued with discussions about next steps, how the school would handle the incident, what measures would ensure Noah could return to the classroom without further trauma. Richard listened as if submerged, voices muffled in his ears, his mind still trapped in the past, in the unbelievable connections fate had woven. When the meeting ended, Richard stayed seated as others left. Only Michael remained behind, gathering his belongings with deliberate slowness. When they were finally alone, the businessman approached the teacher. "Do you know what happened to me after you humiliated me, Mr. Thompson?" he asked, his voice surprisingly calm. "I never went back to that school. My parents, who made enormous sacrifices to keep me enrolled there, had to transfer me to a much lesser institution. I lost an entire year, almost dropped out completely." Richard raised his eyes, seeing traces of the boy he once knew in the man's face. "I'm sorry," he murmured, "truly from the bottom of my heart." "You changed my life that day," Michael continued, ignoring the apology. "For a long time, it was for the worse. But eventually, I turned that pain into determination. I swore I'd one day create a better environment for kids like me, like my son." He paused. "I never imagined that path would bring me back to face the man who caused it all." "Fate has a peculiar sense of humor," Richard remarked, a sad smile on his lips. "It wasn't fate, Mr. Thompson." Michael's voice hardened. "When I learned I'd need to transfer Noah to a new school after our recent return to the United States, I researched every option carefully. When I saw your name on this school's faculty list, something inside me ignited. Part of me wanted to run away, to keep my son far from the man who hurt me. Another part wanted to see if time had taught him anything." The revelation struck Richard like a bolt of lightning. It was no coincidence. Michael had deliberately chosen to enroll his son in the school where he taught. "You used your own son to test me?" he asked, incredulous. "I would never expose Noah to any risk on purpose," Michael replied coldly. "I believed, perhaps naively, that 25 years would have turned an arrogant young teacher into a wise and compassionate educator." He adjusted his jacket. "I was wrong." Michael walked to the door, pausing before leaving. "You'll be hearing from me soon, Mr. Thompson. This story isn't over yet." With those cryptic words, he left the room, leaving behind a devastated Richard, confronted not only with his recent mistake but with an entire life built on principles that now seemed deeply flawed. In the days that followed, Richard stayed home away from school, lost in painful introspection. He mentally revisited every moment of his career, every interaction with his students over the years. How many others had he hurt with his inflexible rigidity? How many lives had he negatively impacted in the name of discipline and rules? On one particularly gloomy afternoon, as he rummaged through old boxes of memories searching for something he couldn't even define, he found a yellowed photo album. Flipping through it, he came across a picture of his first class as a teacher. In the back row, partially hidden behind taller classmates, was a skinny boy with a school hat different from the others. Michael Wilson, at 12 years old. Richard ran his fingers over the faded image, a lump forming in his throat. How could he have forgotten? Why hadn't he made the connection before? The answer was simple and devastating, because back then, Michael had been just another troublesome student who refused to follow the rules, not a human being with feelings, needs, and unique circumstances. The phone rang, pulling him from his dark thoughts. It was Barbara, the principal. "Richard," she said, her voice sounding tired even through the line, "the board has reached a decision about your case." The professor closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable. "I'm being fired," he concluded, feeling a strange relief at finally facing the consequences of his actions. "Actually, no." The answer caught him off guard. "Mr. Wilson withdrew the investigation request this morning. He said that after speaking with his son, he decided it would be better to resolve the situation another way." "Another way? What does that mean?" "He didn't go into details. He only said he'd contact you personally." Barbara paused. "The board decided to extend your leave for another week as a precaution, but you'll be able to return to your duties after that." Richard hung up the phone, more confused than relieved. What was Michael planning? Was this some kind of elaborate revenge, something that would destroy him more permanently than a simple firing? He didn't have to wait long to find out. The next morning, his apartment doorbell rang. Opening the door, he found a uniformed driver holding out an envelope. "Mr. Richard Thompson, I've been instructed to deliver this personally and await your response." With trembling hands, Richard opened the envelope and found an elegant card bearing the crest of the Progress Educational Foundation. The message was short and direct. "Mr. Thompson, I'd like to invite you to a meeting at my home today at 2 p.m. My driver is at your disposal to bring you. This is not a professional invitation, but a personal one. I sincerely hope you'll accept. Michael Wilson." Richard reread the message several times, trying to decipher its intentions. Was it a trap, a final confrontation, or something completely different? He decided that whatever it was, he owed Michael and himself this meeting. "Please inform Mr. Wilson that I'll be ready at the agreed time," he replied to the driver, who nodded and left. At exactly 2 p.m., Richard was driven by a limousine to one of the most exclusive gated communities in New York City. Michael Wilson's mansion was exactly what one would expect from a man of his standing: imposing, elegant, and undeniably expensive. The driver led him through a meticulously kept garden to the main entrance, where a housekeeper greeted him and took him to a spacious living room. Michael was already waiting, dressed more casually than in their previous meeting, though still impeccably elegant. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for accepting my invitation," he said, gesturing to a comfortable armchair. "Would you like coffee? Or perhaps something stronger?" "Coffee is fine, thank you," Richard replied, too tense to fully relax. As the housekeeper served the coffee, the two men sat in heavy silence. Richard discreetly observed the room, noticing the family photos scattered about. In many of them, Noah appeared smiling beside his father, always wearing the same grey hat that had sparked the whole situation. "I imagine you're wondering why I invited you here today," Michael began after the housekeeper left. "I admit I am," Richard said, taking a sip of coffee to buy time, "especially after withdrawing the investigation request." Michael stood and walked to one of the windows, gazing at the garden for a moment before turning back to the teacher. "I've spent the last few days talking a lot with Noah, about what happened, about how he felt, about what he'd like to see happen now." The businessman paused. Do you know what surprised me the most? An 8-year-old boy's ability to show more wisdom and compassion than many adults I know. Richard nodded silently, waiting for him to continue. Noah told me he doesn't want you to lose your job. He said he understands people make mistakes, that he believes you can learn and change. The words struck Richard deeply. The generosity of that boy he had hurt was almost incomprehensible. Your son is extraordinary, he said sincerely. Yes, he is. A genuine smile brightened Michael's face for the first time, and it made me think a lot about my own feelings, about the resentment I've carried for so long, about what I truly want to teach my son. The businessman sat back down, now directly facing Richard. I didn't call you here to humiliate you or to seek revenge, Mr. Thompson. I called you because I believe there may be an opportunity here. An opportunity for both of us to learn something, to break a cycle of pain that's lasted too long. I'm listening, Richard said, genuinely intrigued. I have a proposal for you, Michael continued, an experiment, if you will, something that might seem strange at first, but that I believe is important. The teacher waited, apprehensive. I'd like you to spend an entire day wearing this. Michael opened a box on the coffee table, revealing a bright, colorful hat, very different from the understated one Noah wore. In public, to truly understand what it feels like to be vulnerable, exposed, different. Richard stared at the hat, a mix of surprise and discomfort on his face. Is this a punishment? No, Mr. Thompson. It's an opportunity for growth. Michael leaned forward. I'm not asking to humiliate you. I'm asking you to experience, even if briefly, what it's like to be on the other side. To feel the stares, the muffled laughter, the discomfort of being different in a world that values conformity above all else. Richard took the hat, examining it carefully. It was an unusual proposal, but he could see the logic behind it. More than that, he could see the opportunity for redemption being offered to him. And after this experiment? He asked, still uncertain. Afterward, we'll talk again, you, me, and Noah, and we'll decide together how to move forward. Michael smiled slightly. Consider this the first step on a journey of mutual understanding. Richard reflected for a moment. He could refuse, of course. He could simply find another job at another school, far from those painful memories. But something inside him knew running away wouldn't solve anything. It would only perpetuate the cycle of ignorance and insensitivity that had defined much of his professional life. I accept your proposal, Mr. Wilson, he finally replied, placing the colorful hat on his head. When do we begin? Right now, if you're willing, Michael answered, a glint of approval in his eyes. My driver can take you to some busy spots in the city, a mall perhaps, or Central Park, which is always crowded on Sundays. Though deeply uncomfortable, Richard nodded. He glanced briefly at the mirror in the room, hardly recognizing the serious, respected man wearing that vibrant hat, which seemed completely out of place with his traditionally reserved appearance. I'll be waiting for your return at the end of the day, Michael said, walking him to the door. And, Mr. Thompson, thank you for accepting this challenge. It means more than you realize. As he stepped back into the limousine, now wearing the eye-catching hat, Richard felt a strange mix of apprehension and hope. Perhaps from this painful situation, something transformative could emerge, for him, for Michael, and for Noah. Maybe, after 25 years, he was finally ready to learn the most important lesson of all, that true education begins with empathy, and no rule should ever override human dignity. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, clearly surprised by the hat but remaining professional. Where would you like to go first, sir? He asked politely. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision he'd made. To the busiest mall in the city, please, he replied, knowing his journey of transformation had only just begun. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Richard caught sight of a small figure watching him from one of the second-floor windows. Noah, in his grey hat, waved timidly at him. Without hesitation, Richard waved back, silently sealing a promise of change that, in that moment, felt as important as any commitment he had ever made in his life. The Fifth Avenue Mall was particularly busy that Saturday afternoon. Families strolled through the wide corridors, Teenagers gathered in the food courts and couples of all ages enjoyed the weekend buzz. Amid all this normalcy, Richard Thompson walked uncomfortably aware of the colourful hat he wore, a bold piece with vibrant patterns that seemed to scream for attention, clashing with his subdued clothing and naturally discreet demeanour. For the first 2 hours of the experience, Richard tried to act normally, as if he didn't notice the curious looks he attracted. He browsed bookstores, window shopped, even sat down for coffee. But every movement was accompanied by a sharp awareness of his difference. A group of teenagers openly laughed as he passed by, making no effort to hide their comments about the crazy old man with the hat. A clerk kept glancing at his head while helping him, clearly distracted by the unusual accessory. It's just a hat, Richard thought, feeling strangely vulnerable. Why do people have to make such a spectacle of it? The answer, of course, came to him immediately. This must be exactly how Noah felt every day. Exactly how young Michael, decades earlier, had felt under his own merciless scrutiny. It was on public transportation, during his return from the mall, that the encounter which would change the course of this experience took place. The bus was crowded, forcing Richard to stand while holding onto one of the rails. His colourful hat swayed slightly with the movement of the vehicle, drawing discreet and not so discreet glances from other passengers. "I like your hat," said a voice beside him. Richard turned to find the gentle smile of an elderly woman, likely in her 70s, seated in one of the priority seats. "Thank you," he replied, surprised by the unexpected comment. "It reminds me of my husband," she continued, her eyes bright with distant memories. "He had one just like it, wore it to hide his baldness, but it ended up becoming his trademark. Everyone in the neighborhood knew him as Old Ben with the colorful hat." Richard smiled, relaxing a little for the first time that day. "I'm not used to wearing something like this," he admitted. "Actually, let's say I'm conducting an experiment." "An experiment?" The woman's curiosity was genuine. The teacher hesitated for a moment, but something in her kind expression encouraged him to go on. "I'm trying to understand what it's like to be different, to feel the stares, the judgments, the sense of not fitting in." The woman nodded slowly, understanding lighting up her wrinkled face. "You know, young man," she said, though Richard was already in his 50s, "I've learned something important in my 78 years of life. The most painful judgments are the ones we don't even realize we're making." The words struck Richard with unexpected force. "How so?" he asked, genuinely interested. "My name is Mrs. Eleanor, by the way," she introduced herself with a smile, "and I'm talking about how we often hurt others deeply without even noticing, not out of malice, but from lack of perspective." The bus stopped at a station. Some people got off, others got on, but Richard barely noticed, absorbed in the conversation. "I had a son, Brian," Mrs. Eleanor continued, her voice softening with memory. "When he was 12, his teacher made him sit in the corner of the classroom because he couldn't stay still for long. ADHD diagnosis. Back then, no one even talked about that. To everyone, he was just the problem child." Richard felt a lump form in his throat, remembering how many problem children he had labelled over his career. "What happened to him?" he asked, almost fearing the answer. "He grew up believing there was something fundamentally wrong with him." Mrs. Eleanor's gaze grew distant. "He dropped out in his first year of high school, even though he was brilliant at math. Today he runs an auto repair shop. He's successful at what he does, but he never fully regained the confidence he lost in those school years." The teacher lowered his head, feeling the weight of the woman's words. "I'm a teacher," he confessed finally, "and I'm afraid I've done exactly that to many students over the years." The look Mrs. Eleanor gave him held no judgment, only deep understanding. "The fact that you're wearing that hat today suggests you're trying to change that," she observed. "I am," Richard confirmed. "But I'm starting to realize the damage I caused may be greater than I ever imagined. It's never too late to make amends, son," said Mrs. Eleanor, gently placing a hand on his. "Acknowledging it is already half the battle." When the bus reached the stop where Mrs. Eleanor would get off, she stood up with some difficulty. Before heading to the door, she looked at Richard one more time. "Do you know the greatest gift I gave my Brian after I understood what had Happened? She asked. Richard shook his head. I apologized, not for doing something directly, but for not noticing, for not fighting harder for him when I should have. Her eyes shone with restrained emotion. And then I showed. Through my actions that I had learned the lesson. It was enough for us to start rebuilding our relationship. With those words, Mrs. Eleanor stepped off the bus, leaving behind a deeply pensive Richard. The rest of the ride passed in a blur, his mind filled with the woman's words, intertwined, with memories of his own career, of Michael, of Noah, of all the students who had passed through his hands over the years. When he finally returned to Michael Wilson's mansion, it was already early evening. The driver led him through the garden once more, but this time Richard noticed details he had ignored before. The carefully tended flowers, a small space. That looked like a child's garden, likely Noah's project, a modest but well-built treehouse. Michael was waiting in the same room, now softly lit and cozy. Richard noticed the businessman's eyes immediately go to the hat, which he was still wearing, but Michael made no comment about it. "How was your experience, Mr. Thompson?" Michael asked, gesturing to the same seat Richard had occupied hours earlier. "Different than I expected," he answered honestly, finally removing the hat and placing it on the table. "More revealing." Michael nodded, pouring 2 cups of tea that were already prepared. "Would you like to share?" Richard accepted the offered cup, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "I felt exposed, vulnerable," he began. "Every glance, every laugh, every whisper, it all seemed directed at me, at my hat, at my difference." "I know that feeling well," Michael remarked, his tone neutral but attentive. "But what really struck me," Richard paused, searching for the right words, "was realizing how much power we have over how others feel, and how often we're unaware of that power." Something shifted subtly in Michael's expression, a tension easing perhaps, or the beginning of shared understanding. "I met a woman on the bus," Richard continued. "She told me about her son, about how the labels he got in school affected his entire life, and I realized I've probably done the same to countless students over the years." His voice wavered slightly. "To you, to Noah, and how many others I don't even remember." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. A contemplative silence filled the room as Michael absorbed the teacher's words. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a different tone, less defensive, more reflective. "You know, Mr. Thompson, I spent years harboring resentment over what happened that day." Michael turned the cup in his hands, watching the liquid swirl. "I turned that humiliation into fuel. One day I'll show him," I thought. "One day I'll be in a position to make him feel what I felt." Richard nodded, understanding more than Michael could imagine. "And then when I finally had that opportunity," the businessman continued, "when I saw you do to my son exactly what you had done to me." He shook his head, as if still trying to understand. "I felt angry, of course, but I also felt a deep sadness, as if a painful cycle was repeating itself, and I was powerless to break it." "Is that why we're here now?" Richard asked softly. "Trying to break that cycle?" "Noah taught me that," Michael replied, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "When I told him about our past, about how you had humiliated me in the same way decades ago, do you know what he said?" Richard shook his head, curious. "He said, 'Ma, Daddy, if you make him suffer like he made you suffer, then you both become the same. Someone has to stop first.'" Michael chuckled softly. 8 years old, and already wiser than me. The teacher felt his eyes moisten. The wisdom of that child, able to see beyond the cycle of hurt and retaliation, was truly extraordinary. "Your son is remarkable," he commented with sincere admiration. "He's watching us, you know." Michael discreetly pointed to a slightly open door in the corner of the room. "He asked to listen to our conversation, said it was important to him." Richard turned toward the door, catching a quick movement behind it, likely Noah retreating when he realized he'd been spotted. "You can come in, son," Michael called gently. "I know you're there." After a few hesitant seconds, the door opened fully, revealing Noah, wearing his inseparable gray hat. The boy stepped timidly into the room, his eyes shifting between his father and the teacher. "Hello, Noah," Richard greeted, feeling a wave of shame as he remembered his behavior in the classroom. "Hi, Mr. Thompson," the boy replied, his voice quiet but steady. "Did you wear the hat all day?" "Yes, I did," Richard confirmed, picking up the colorful hat from the table. "It was an important experience for me." Noah stepped closer, examining the colorful hat with curiosity. "Did people laugh at you?" he asked with the directness only children possess. "Some did," Richard admitted. "Others just gave me strange looks. A very special lady said she liked it." The boy nodded as if confirming something he had expected. "When I started losing my hair because of the medicine," Noah said, instinctively touching his own hat, "I was really scared to go to school. I thought everyone would laugh." Richard's heart clenched at the boy's disarmingly honest words. "My dad gave me this hat," Noah continued, offering a small smile to Michael. "He said it would give me courage, that it would be our secret, that no one needed to know what was underneath." "That was a very good idea from your dad," Richard remarked, swallowing the lump in his throat. "But then you yelled at me in front of everyone," Noah's voice trembled slightly, "and you took my hat off, and everyone saw." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with emotion. Richard fought the urge to justify himself, to hide behind the rules and procedures that had always been his shield. Instead, he took a deep breath and did what he knew was necessary. "Noah," he said, looking directly into the boy's eyes, "what I did was unforgivable. I hurt you deeply, exposed you when I should have protected you. I humiliated you when I should have welcomed you." He paused, making sure the boy understood the sincerity of his words. "I am truly sorry, and I'll understand. If you can't forgive me now, or ever." Noah studied the teacher for a long moment, his eyes revealing a maturity beyond his years. "Do you have something you're ashamed of too?" he finally asked, catching both Richard and Michael by surprise. The teacher blinked, taken aback by the unexpected question. His mind raced through various possibilities, lying to the child, dodging the question, offering some generic and safe answer. But something about the honesty of that moment, the vulnerability shared by everyone present, pushed him toward a sincerity he rarely allowed himself. "Yes, Noah," he finally answered. "Many things, actually." The boy kept looking at him as if waiting for more. Michael remained silent, watching the interaction with respectful attention. "When I was a child," Richard continued, his voice softer than Noah had ever heard it, "my family was very poor. We lived in a slum in the East Bronx. My father was a construction worker, my mother a cleaner. They struggled hard just to give us the basics." Noah nodded, completely absorbed in the story. "I got a scholarship to a private school when I was about your age. It was my family's big hope." A sad smile appeared on Richard's lips. "But I was the only scholarship student in my class. My clothes were different, my accent was different, my lunch was different. Everything about me screamed that I didn't belong there." "Did the kids make fun of you?" Noah asked, his eyes showing understanding. "Every day," Richard confirmed. "The way I talked, the patched-up clothes I wore, even the smell of cheap laundry soap my mother used to keep my uniform spotless." Michael watched silently, seeing a side of the teacher he'd never considered before. "One day," Richard went on, "I discovered something important. If I was perfect with the rules, if I dressed impeccably, if I spoke flawlessly, if I never broke a single rule, somehow it protected me. It became my armor." "Like a hat," Noah suggested with surprising intuition. "Exactly like a hat," Richard agreed, his eyes briefly meeting Michael's. "But instead of something I wore, it was something I did. Following the rules, being perfect, demanding perfection. And over time you forgot it was just protection," Noah finished, showing a depth of understanding that left both adults momentarily speechless. "Yes," Richard admitted, feeling as if something heavy and old was finally being lifted from his chest. "Over time, I forgot it was just protection. I forgot that behind the rules, the demands, the strictness, there were people. People with feelings, stories, pain." A comfortable silence filled the room as Noah absorbed the teacher's words. Finally, the boy took a few hesitant steps toward Richard and, to everyone's surprise, reached out to touch the colorful hat resting on the table. "I think you look good in this hat," he said with a small smile. "It suits you better than that angry teacher in my classroom." The remark, so simple yet so profound, hit Richard with unexpected force. It was as if Noah could see past the persona he'd built over decades, reaching something more authentic, more human. "Thank you, Noah," he replied, fighting back, the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. "That means a lot to me." Michael watched the interaction, his expression a mix of complex emotions, relief, tenderness, and perhaps the beginning of a deeper understanding of the man who for so long had just been the teacher who humiliated him. "I think it's getting late for you, son," Michael said, checking his watch. "How about getting ready for bed? I promise we'll talk more about this tomorrow." Noah hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave such an important moment behind. "Will the teacher come back tomorrow?" he asked, looking hopefully at Richard. The teacher glanced at Michael, uncertain how to respond. The businessman nodded discreetly. "If you'd like, yes. I'll come back," Richard answered. Noah's face lit up with a smile. "Good night, then," he said, heading to the door. Before leaving, he turned one last time. "And Mr. Thompson, I forgive you." With those simple words, the boy walked out, leaving behind two men deeply moved by the wisdom and compassion of an 8-year-old. "Your son is extraordinary," Richard remarked after a moment of emotional silence. "He surprises me every day," Michael agreed, pouring more tea for them both. "I keep thinking how different things might have been if in the past someone had done for me what we're trying to do for him now." "Breaking the cycle," Richard murmured, more to himself than to Michael. "Exactly," the businessman agreed. "You know, when I took over the school's foundation, it wasn't to find you or seek revenge." "No?" Richard asked, genuinely surprised. "No. It was because I believe I can turn that institution into something better than it was for us, more humane, more welcoming." Michael paused. "Maybe that's why fate brought us back together. Perhaps we needed this chance to heal, not just personally, but to contribute to something greater." Richard nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind. "I think you're right," he said finally. "And maybe I can help with that change." "How?" Michael asked, genuinely interested. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I know I need to start by publicly acknowledging my mistake, not just to you and Noah, but to the entire school community." Richard straightened in his chair, a new determination in his eyes. "And then, perhaps we can work together to create an environment where other children won't have to go through what you and Noah did." Michael studied the teacher for a long moment, as if weighing his sincerity. What he found seemed to satisfy him, for he extended his hand for a handshake. "I think this is the start of something important, Mr. Thompson," he said with a genuine smile. Richard accepted the handshake, feeling the symbolic weight of the gesture, not just a truce between former adversaries, but the promise of a new path, a new understanding. "I agree, Mr. Wilson," he replied, returning the smile. "And I believe we have much to learn from your son." When Richard left the Wilson mansion that night, he carried not only the colorful hat he'd worn that day, but a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. The driver took him back to his apartment in silence, respecting the teacher's obvious introspection. Entering his modest apartment, Richard was met with the usual quiet. He'd never married, never had children. His life had been the school, his students, his books. Looking around, he realized how the space mirrored his own rigidity. Everything arranged at perfect angles, books methodically sorted, not a single item out of place. He walked to the shelf and pulled out an old photo album. Flipping through it slowly, he came across images of his career as an educator. Graduations, awards, school events. In every photo, the same stern expression, the same rigid posture, the same carefully cultivated distance. "Who are you really, Richard Thompson?" he asked himself, staring at his reflection in the living room mirror. "Who is the man behind the armor?" The questions went unanswered that night, but something had begun, a process of discovery, of reconnecting with himself that could no longer be ignored. The next morning, Richard woke early, as he always did. But instead of following his usual routine, he made an impulsive decision. He put on the colorful hat and went for a walk around the neighborhood. This time, not as a forced experiment, but as an exercise in liberation. The reactions were similar to those from the day before: curious glances, a few smiles, the occasional comment. But his own reaction was changing. Instead of feeling exposed and vulnerable, he began to feel a strange sense of freedom, as if every step with that extravagant hat took him a little further from the armor he had built over his entire adult life. It was during this walk that his phone rang. It was Barbara, the principal. "Richard?" Her voice sounded tense. "We need to talk urgently. Can you come to the school today?" "Did something happen?" he asked, suddenly uneasy. "Several teachers are threatening to resign in solidarity with you," Barbara explained. "They found out what happened with Mr. Wilson's son and are outraged by your suspension." "We're about to face an institutional crisis." Richard stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, shocked by the news. His colleagues were standing up for him, without knowing the full story, without knowing what had really happened. "I'll be there in an hour," he promised, hanging up. He quickly returned home, changed his clothes, opting for a less formal look than his usual suit and tie. Before leaving, he hesitated in front of the mirror, staring at the colorful hat he had placed on the table. After a moment of thought, he decided to take it with him. When he arrived at the school, the tension was palpable. Groups of teachers spoke in hushed tones in the hallways, falling silent when they saw him. A few approached, offering words of support and solidarity. Richard thanked them politely, but continued on to the principal's office, where he found Barbara visibly stressed. "The situation is spiraling out of control," she said as soon as he entered. "Half the faculty is threatening to walk out if you're not reinstated immediately. Some parents are already being mobilized. This could turn into a scandal of unimaginable proportions." "Where is Mr. Wilson?" Richard asked, keeping his composure. "He arrived 10 minutes ago. He's in the conference room with 2 board members." Barbara nervously adjusted her glasses. "Richard, what's really going on? He seemed different today, less hostile. He mentioned something about a conversation you two had yesterday." "It's a long story, Barbara," Richard replied, "but I believe we can turn this crisis into an opportunity." The principal looked at him curiously, noticing for the first time the colorful hat he held in his hands. "Do you have a plan?" she asked. "Actually, yes," Richard answered, a quiet determination in his voice. "Could you gather all the teachers in the auditorium? And would it be possible to invite Mr. Wilson to join us?" Barbara hesitated, clearly worried about what Richard might be planning. "Trust me," he assured her, with a gentleness he rarely showed. "I believe I can resolve this." An hour later, the school auditorium was full. Teachers filled most of the seats, with a few board members and administrative staff scattered among them. In the front row, Michael Wilson sat beside Barbara, his face unreadable but his eyes following Richard's every move as he stood on the small stage. "Thank you all for being here," Richard began, his voice steady despite the obvious tension in the room. "I know many of you came today in solidarity with me, and I'm deeply grateful for that. But before you take any action, there's something you need to know." An expectant silence fell over the auditorium. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of decades of career, countless interactions with students, and the many times he had prioritized rules over people. "I was wrong," he said simply, the words echoing through the silent space. "Not just with the student Noah Wilson, but likely with hundreds of others throughout my career." A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. Some teachers exchanged confused glances. "For 25 years, I believed that strict discipline, unquestioning adherence to rules, and maintaining inflexible standards were the essence of good education." Richard paused, looking directly at Michael. "I was wrong." The businessman held his gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "What I did to Noah Wilson was unforgivable. I humiliated a vulnerable child in the name of rules. I exposed his medical condition in front of all his classmates. I caused harm that no administrative punishment can undo." Richard raised the colorful hat he was holding. "Over the past 2 days, I've had the chance to experience, even if briefly, what it's like to be on the other side, to feel exposed, vulnerable, different." The teachers listened in absolute silence, many clearly surprised by Richard's unusual candor. "I also discovered this wasn't an isolated incident," he continued. 25 years ago, I did something very similar to another student. a boy who wore a hat to hide a similar medical condition. His eyes met Michael's again. That boy grew up to become Mr. Michael Wilson, who is sitting right here in the front row. The murmurs grew louder, a few gasps of surprise echoing through the auditorium. Fate has a peculiar sense of humor, doesn't it? Richard allowed himself a small, melancholy smile. The student I humiliated in my first week as a teacher returned as the father of the student I humiliated in what could have been my last week, as a teacher. Michael stood slowly, all eyes turning to him. "Mr. Wilson, would you join me up here?" Richard invited. The businessman walked to the stage, tension evident in his movements. When the two men stood side by side, Richard continued, "Many of you are ready to protest my suspension. I appreciate the support, truly. But I need you to understand this isn't a case of injustice. It's a learning opportunity, a chance to fundamentally rethink how we educate, how we interact with our students, how we balance rules and humanity." "Mr. Thompson is right," Michael interjected, his voice clear and firm. "What happened to my son and to me decades ago isn't about one problematic teacher. It's a symptom of an educational system that often values conformity over understanding, rules over people." Richard nodded, grateful for Michael's understanding. "That's why," the teacher continued, "I'm not here asking to be reinstated. I'm here proposing something different. A collective reflection on how we can transform this institution into a more welcoming, more humane environment, one that's more attentive to each student's individual needs. And that's why," Michael added, "I'm no longer demanding Mr. Thompson's dismissal. Instead, I'm proposing that he lead a new educational project focused precisely on empathy and respect for differences." A stunned silence filled the auditorium. No one had expected this turn. The teacher confessing his mistake, the outraged father offering a chance at redemption, both united in a common purpose that seemed to have emerged from the conflict itself. It would be a pilot program, Michael explained, now addressing the teachers. An initiative to rethink teaching practices, to develop tools that help educators handle diversity in the classroom, to create protocols that ensure no child feels humiliated or excluded because of their differences. And who better to lead this initiative, Richard continued, than someone who has lived on both sides of this equation. Someone who made the mistake and is now determined to correct it, not just for themselves but for the entire system. The proposal hung in the air for a few moments as the teachers absorbed the magnitude of what was being suggested. Finally, a hand rose from the audience. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson," said the fifth-grade math teacher, "how can we trust that someone who publicly humiliated a vulnerable child is truly fit to lead a project on empathy and respect?" The question, though harsh, was fair. Richard acknowledged it with a nod. "An excellent question, Sarah," he replied, "and my answer is, you can't. Not yet. I'll need to demonstrate through concrete actions that I've truly learned from my mistakes, that I'm committed to real change, not just in my words but in my daily practice. That's why I'm proposing a probationary period," Michael added. 6 months during which Mr. Thompson will work under the direct supervision of the school board and educational consultants I'll bring in. If, after that time, the school community isn't convinced of his commitment and ability to lead the project, we'll explore other options. Gradually, the mood in the auditorium began to shift. The initial shock gave way to cautious curiosity, an openness to consider the possibilities this unusual proposal presented. More hands went up, questions were asked, concerns were voiced. Richard and Michael answered each one with honesty and transparency, neither downplaying the severity of what had happened nor losing sight of the transformative potential that could arise from this painful situation. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, a consensus began to form. Not unanimity. Some teachers and board members still had reservations, but a collective willingness to try, to give the project a chance, and by extension, to give Richard one. When the meeting finally ended, many gathered in smaller groups to continue the conversation. Richard was speaking with 2 colleagues when he noticed a small commotion at the auditorium entrance. Noah had arrived, accompanied by a woman who appeared to be a caregiver or tutor. The boy hesitated as he looked at the crowd of adults, clearly intimidated, but when he spotted his father on stage, He began making his way through the people. Michael, noticing his son's presence, quickly stepped down to meet him. "Daddy, can I speak?" Noah asked, looking anxiously at his father. "Speak. Here?" Michael seemed surprised. "Are you sure, son?" Noah nodded firmly. "I was listening by the door. I want to say something." Michael hesitated briefly, but something in his son's determined expression convinced him. He took the boy's hand and led him through the crowd to the stage, where Richard still stood. "Noah would like to say a few words," Michael announced, his voice rising above the chatter. Gradually, the auditorium fell silent, all eyes turning to the small boy in the grey hat. Richard felt a tightness in his chest as he watched Noah step onto the stage, imagining how much courage it must have taken for the child he had publicly humiliated just days before. "Hi," Noah began, his voice quiet at first, but growing stronger as he spoke. "My name is Noah Wilson. I'm in 2nd grade, and—" he lightly touched his hat. "I have a problem with my hair because of some medication I take." A respectful silence filled the auditorium. Some teachers exchanged emotional glances, moved by the boy's courage. "Mr. Thompson took my hat, off in class in front of everyone," continued Noah, briefly glancing at Richard. "I felt really sad and ashamed. I never wanted to come back to school." Richard lowered his head, feeling the weight of the boy's simple yet powerful words. "But later the teacher came to my house. He wore a colorful hat all day, even when people looked at him funny." Noah pointed to the hat Richard was still holding, "and he apologized to me for real, not just with words, with actions." The boy paused, seeming to search for the right words to express what he felt. "My dad taught me that forgiving is important, not just for the person who did something wrong, but for us, too." Noah looked at his father, receiving an encouraging smile. "I forgave Mr. Thompson, and I think you all should forgive too." The simplicity and wisdom of those words struck everyone present. An 8-year-old boy, who had every reason to hold on to resentment, was demonstrating an understanding of forgiveness and reconciliation that many adults would never reach. "Thank you, Noah," said Barbara, the principal, breaking the emotional silence that followed. Her voice trembled slightly. "Your courage and wisdom teach us so much today." A spontaneous applause rose from the back of the auditorium, quickly spreading. Soon everyone was on their feet, clapping not just for Noah but for the moment of transformation they were witnessing. The beginning of something new, born from a painful mistake, but redeemed by the courage to face it honestly. As he watched the unusual scene, Richard felt a growing certainty within himself. No matter what happened to his career from that point on, this moment marked a turning point. An opportunity not just to repair the harm done, but to contribute to a broader, deeper change. In education, in the lives he would touch, and most importantly, in himself. The colorful hat in his hands was no longer just a symbol of exposure and vulnerability. It had become a tangible reminder that behind every rule, every protocol, every structure, there were people with their stories, their pain, their unique needs, and that no rule should ever override the basic human dignity everyone deserved. When Noah stepped off the stage, running back into his father's arms, Richard felt strangely light, as if a weight he'd carried for decades, without even realizing it, had finally begun to lift. The path ahead would be challenging, no doubt. Earning the trust of his colleagues, his students, and the parents would take time and consistent effort. Changing his own practices, ingrained by years of habit, wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, he truly felt like an educator, not just someone who imparted knowledge or enforced discipline, but someone committed to the whole growth of his students, including their emotional and social well-being. And it had all started with a hat. A simple grey hat, which had hidden not just a boy's temporary condition, but a profound lesson about humanity, empathy, and the courage it takes to acknowledge and correct our mistakes. As the crowd began to disperse, Richard stepped off the stage and approached Noah and Michael. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "Both of you." Noah smiled shyly, still nestled in his father's protective embrace. "This is just the beginning, Mr. Thompson. Michael replied, extending his hand for a handshake. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." Richard accepted the handshake, feeling the full symbolism of that gesture. Not just a truce between adversaries, but the beginning of an unexpected partnership born from the ashes of an old grudge. "Yes," he agreed, a genuine smile lighting up his tired face. "And I can't wait to get started." As they walked out of the auditorium together, with Noah between them, Richard reflected on the strange paths of fate. How could he have imagined, in that classroom just days before, that a moment of inflexibility and insensitivity would lead him to one of the most transformative experiences of his life? The journey had only just begun, and the challenges would be many. But with each step, Richard felt closer to rediscovering not just the educator he could be, but the human being who had been buried under decades of rigidity and fear, and all because of a hat, a simple grey hat, which had become, against all odds, the catalyst for a profound personal and professional transformation. The days following the meeting in the auditorium were filled with intense activity at Horizon Academy. What had started as an institutional crisis had turned into an unexpected opportunity for renewal. Richard, Michael, and Principal Barbara spent long hours working out the details of the new educational project, which was soon officially named the Horizon Program for Empathy and Inclusion. The news spread quickly through the school community. While some parents expressed skepticism about Richard's ability to lead an initiative focused on the very values he had seemed to ignore, others saw the proposal as a golden opportunity to transform the school into a truly inclusive environment. "I still can't believe we're actually doing this," Richard remarked one afternoon during a planning session in Barbara's office, spreading documents across the table. "Having doubts?" Michael asked, looking up from the papers he was reviewing. "Not exactly doubts," the teacher replied, choosing his words carefully. "More like astonishment. If someone had told me 2 weeks ago that I'd be collaborating with you on a project about empathy and inclusion, life has a peculiar sense of humor," Michael finished with a slight smile. "And impeccable timing," added Barbara, who had just entered the room carrying a tray of coffee. "The Department of Education just announced a call for proposals on emotional well-being in schools. If we work quickly, we can submit our proposal before the deadline. That could mean extra funding for implementation," Michael noted, brightening at the possibility. "And external validation," Richard added, "something that would definitely help convince the skeptics." As they discussed the technical details of the project, Richard noticed a quiet presence at the slightly open door. Noah, with his inseparable grey hat, was watching the meeting with curious eyes. "Hello, Noah," Richard greeted, pausing the conversation. "Would you like to join us?" The boy hesitated briefly, looking at his father for approval. With Michael's encouraging nod, he stepped timidly into the room. "We're discussing the project you helped create," Richard explained, pointing to an empty chair beside him. "Would you like to share your thoughts?" Noah's eyes widened in surprise at the invitation. "I can." "Of course you can," Barbara replied with a warm smile. "In fact, we were just talking about how to include student voices in the project. Who better to start with than you?" The boy sat down, eyeing the scattered documents with curiosity. "What are you working on?" he asked, pointing to a colorful diagram Richard had drawn. "We're trying to figure out how to help teachers and students understand each other better," Richard explained in simple terms. "So what happened to you and to your father never happens again." Noah nodded solemnly, absorbing the explanation. "For you know what would be cool?" he suggested after a moment of reflection. "If kids could tell their stories like I told mine in the auditorium." The three adults exchanged surprised glances. The suggestion was both simple and profound. "You mean creating spaces for students to share their experiences?" asked Barbara, intrigued. "Yeah," confirmed Noah, gaining confidence. "When I talked about my hat and why I wear it, everyone understood. It got easier." "Humanizing differences through personal narratives," murmured Richard, as if testing the concept. "It's brilliant, Noah." The boy smiled, clearly proud that his contribution was valued. "We could start with a pilot project in the second-grade classes," suggested Barbara, already making notes. "A safe space where kids can share something about themselves that makes them feel different or special." With proper guidance from the teachers, of course, added Richard, and absolute respect for anyone who doesn't feel comfortable participating. Michael watched the interaction with a quiet smile, visibly moved to see his son actively contributing to a project of that magnitude. "Noah, you just gave us an idea that could change so many kids' lives," he said with genuine paternal pride. "I'm impressed." The boy lowered his head, a slight blush coloring his cheeks, but his smile revealed how much that recognition meant to him. The meeting continued for a few more hours, with Noah staying in the room, occasionally contributing more ideas or simply listening attentively. By the time it ended, it was already dark outside. Michael checked his watch. "Time to head home." "Son," he said, gathering his things, "it's past your dinner time." "But we still have so much to decide," protested Noah, clearly invested in the project. "And we'll have plenty more meetings," assured Richard. "Your contribution today was incredibly valuable, Noah. Thank you." As the boy and his father prepared to leave, Barbara discreetly pulled Richard aside. "You know what I just realized?" she commented quietly. "In all the years I've worked with you, Richard, I've never seen you smile as much as you have these past few days." The teacher reflected on the observation, realizing she was right. Something had shifted deeply within him, not just in his ideas about education, but in his very way of being in the world. "I think I'm finally learning to take off my own hat," he replied cryptically. Barbara tilted her head, intrigued by the metaphor. "Your hat?" "My armor," explained Richard. "The one I built to protect myself, but that ended up keeping me from truly connecting with people." He smiled again. "It's been freeing." The principal nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. "Welcome back, Richard," she said simply, squeezing his shoulder before stepping away. That night, walking home under the starry sky of New York City, Richard felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in decades. The world around him seemed more vivid, full of possibilities. The people passing by were no longer just extras in his daily routine, but individuals with complex stories, dreams, fears, and hopes, just like him. "How could I have lived so long without really seeing?" he wondered as the city lights shimmered around him. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The following weeks were filled with intense work. The project was officially presented to the school community at an event that brought together parents, students, and educators. Richard, who had always avoided public exposure beyond what was strictly necessary, found himself at the center of attention, passionately, explaining the goals and methods of the Horizon program. "This isn't just a project about tolerance," he explained to an attentive audience. "It's about celebrating our differences, about creating an environment where every child feels seen, heard, and valued exactly as they are." For many in attendance, especially those who had known him for years, it was almost impossible to reconcile this eloquent, passionate Richard with the strict, distant teacher he had always been. The transformation was palpable, not just in his words, but in his gestures, his gaze, and the way he interacted with those around him. "Who would have thought all we needed was a hat?" joked a veteran teacher during the reception after the event. "And a brave child to show us the way," Richard added quietly, raising his glass subtly toward Noah, who was chatting animatedly with other children across the room. The project began modestly, with pilot sessions in second-grade classes, including Noah's. Following the boys' suggestion, story circles were created, safe spaces where children were invited to share something about themselves that made them feel special or different. During the first session, Richard observed from a corner of the room, letting the regular teacher lead the activity. At first, the children seemed shy, unsure of what to share. But when Noah took the initiative, removing his hat and calmly explaining his temporary condition, the ice was broken. One girl shared that she wore a hearing aid and often pretended to understand what people said to avoid bothering them. A boy talked about how he struggled to read because the letters danced on the page. Possibly dyslexia, Richard noted mentally, making a reminder to refer the child for specialized evaluation. Another child spoke about feeling different because they were adopted and had two moms. Each story was met with respectful attention, often with expressions of surprise and understanding. The children discovered, many for the first time, that they weren't alone in their feelings of difference or inadequacy. "It's like magic," teacher Jennifer remarked at the end of the session, watching the children play during recess with a new sense of camaraderie. "They look at each other differently now. There's more kindness." "It's not magic," Richard replied, watching the scene with barely contained emotion. "It's humanity. It was always there. We just needed to create the space for it to flourish." The success of the initial sessions led to the program's expansion into other classes. Michael, true to his word, brought in specialists in inclusive education and emotional well-being to train the teachers. Richard, in turn, surprised everyone by enrolling in a specialization course in educational psychology. "It's never too late to learn," he explained to Barbara when she expressed surprise at his decision. "And if I'm going to lead this project, I need more than good intentions. I need solid knowledge." As the months passed, the impact of the Horizon program began to show in measurable ways. There was a reduction in bullying cases, increased classroom participation, and improved indicators of students' emotional well-being. Teachers reported significant changes in classroom dynamics, more collaboration, less competition, and greater respect for individual differences. "We're creating something truly special here," Michael remarked during one of his frequent visits to the school. He and Richard had developed an unexpected but productive partnership, each contributing their unique perspectives and skills to the project. "It's still just the beginning," Richard replied, always cautious in his assessments. "We have much to learn, many adjustments to make." "Always the perfectionist," Michael teased with an understanding smile. "Some things never change, do they?" Richard laughed, acknowledging the truth in that remark. "I suppose you're right. But now I try to be a perfectionist in service of others, not just to protect myself." As they walked through the school hallways, they were surprised by an unusual scene. A group of fourth-grade students had organized a small art exhibition in the main hall with the theme, "What Makes Me Special." There were drawings, collages, small sculptures, each piece accompanied by a brief, explanatory text. "It was their idea," explained the art teacher overseeing the exhibit. After participating in the story circles, they wanted to express their individuality creatively. Richard and Michael walked through the exhibit slowly, stopping to admire each piece. There was an impressive diversity of themes. One girl had created a collage about being the only child of elderly parents. A boy had drawn a detailed picture of his multi-ethnic family. Another had sculpted his hands with 6 fingers each, a condition that had once deeply embarrassed him. "Look what I found," Michael called, stopping in front of a colorful painting. Richard approached and felt a lump in his throat when he recognized the work. It was a painting by Noah, 2 hats side by side, one gray and one colorful, with the caption, "My hat hides me, but it also helped me find a new friend." "Your son is truly extraordinary," Richard remarked, moved by the simplicity and depth of the message. "He's had good teachers," Michael replied with a meaningful look. "Not all of them used chalk and blackboards." At the end of the program's first semester, the school organized a special ceremony to celebrate the progress made. The auditorium was packed. Teachers, staff, students, parents, community representatives, and even journalists invited to document the innovative initiative. Barbara opened the event with an emotional speech about the transformation Horizon Academy had undergone in recent months. Then, several students took the stage to share their experiences with the program, each story more touching than the last. When it was Richard's turn to speak, an expectant silence filled the auditorium. He stepped onto the stage slowly, observing the attentive faces before him. How many times had he stood in that same position, addressing students and parents, with his usual distant formality? Today, however, he felt completely different. 6 months ago, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I made one of the biggest mistakes of my career as an educator. I publicly humiliated a student for wearing a hat in class." The auditorium remained utterly silent, many still uncomfortable with the direct mention of the incident. "That mistake could have ended my career. Maybe at another school with different people involved it would have." Richard paused meaningfully. Instead, it became the start of a journey of transformation, not just for me, but for this entire school community. His eyes met Noah's, sitting in the front row beside his father, still wearing his grey hat even though his hair had begun to grow back normally. I learned that behind every rule, every protocol, every structure we create, there are people, with their stories, their needs, their unique circumstances. And no rule should ever override basic human dignity. Richard then briefly shared the tangible results of the program, the statistics on reduced bullying, the indicators of emotional well-being, the improvements in academic performance. But the most impactful, he emphasized, were the changes that couldn't be easily quantified. The sparkle in a child's eyes when for the first time they feel they belong. The sigh of relief from a student who discovers they're not alone in their differences. The growing confidence of one who always felt invisible. His voice trembled slightly. These are the true results of the Horizon program, and no graph or chart could ever capture them properly. As he concluded his speech, Richard did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He pulled out from a box beside him the colorful hat Michael had given him months earlier, the same one he'd worn during his empathy experiment, and solemnly placed it on his head. This hat taught me more about education than 25 years of theory and practice. He smiled at the stunned audience. Maybe we should all wear one from time to time to remind ourselves what it's like to be on the other side. The auditorium erupted in applause. Many rose in a spontaneous standing ovation, moved by the visible transformation in the man they'd always known as the rigid Mr. Thompson. When the applause finally faded, Barbara took the microphone to announce the evening's final presentation, a song prepared by the second-grade students to celebrate the program. The stage curtains opened, revealing about 20 children lined up, each wearing a different hat, some colorful, some understated, all as unique as their wearers. At the center of the group stood Noah, holding a small microphone. "This song is called All Different, All Important," he announced with a confidence that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "We wrote it ourselves, with help from our music teacher." The simple yet catchy melody filled the auditorium, accompanied by the children's voices, singing about acceptance, empathy, and celebrating differences. At the song's end, the children did something unplanned. They simultaneously removed their hats and tossed them into the air in a gesture of freedom and joy, drawing another wave of applause from the audience. The following months saw the Horizon program solidify and expand. What had begun as a response to a specific crisis had become a model for inclusive education, attracting attention from other institutions. Delegations of educators from across the country began visiting Horizon Academy to learn about the initiative. "I never imagined I'd one day be an example for other educators," Richard confessed to Michael as they watched a group of visitors participating in a story circle with third-grade students. "Life has its own plans for us," the businessman replied with a philosophical smile. "Rarely the ones we imagine for ourselves." The partnership between the two men had evolved into something neither could have predicted. Not quite a friendship, though there were elements of that, but a deep mutual respect rooted in their shared experience of transformation. "You know, what Noah asked me yesterday," Michael remarked as they walked back to the administration building. "What? If you and I were friends when we were kids?" The businessman chuckled softly at the irony. "He can't imagine we were once, well, the opposite of friends." "And what did you tell him?" Richard asked, curious. "The truth. That sometimes people who start as adversaries can become important allies. That sometimes we need to go through hard experiences to grow." Richard nodded, reflecting on the wisdom of that answer. "Your son will go far, Michael. He has an emotional understanding many adults never reach. A large part of this is thanks to you, you know." The businessman paused, looking directly at the teacher. What happened in that classroom was painful, yes, but how we handled it afterward, how we turned it into a learning opportunity that taught Noah something no book ever could. It was the first time Michael had spoken so openly about the positive impact Richard had had on his son's life, and the teacher felt deeply moved by the acknowledgement. "Thank you," he replied simply, knowing no further words were needed. By the end of the school year, the Horizon program had expanded to include a variety of initiatives: story circles, expressive arts workshops, peer mentoring between students of different ages, ongoing teacher training, and even a support group for parents. The year-end ceremony was planned as a special celebration, not just of academic achievements, but of the emotional journey the entire community had taken. Students from all grades prepared artistic performances reflecting the values of empathy, inclusion, and celebration of diversity that had guided the school year. The night before the event, Richard stayed late at school, putting the final touches on some details. As he was about to leave, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Turning around, he saw Noah walking toward him, accompanied by a school staff member. "Noah, what are you doing here so late?" he asked, surprised. "I forgot my science book," the boy explained. "I needed to finish my homework. Dad asked Mrs. Margaret to bring me." The staff member nodded in confirmation. "Mr. Wilson is in an important meeting. He asked me to bring Noah and take him back right after." "I'll just grab my book from my classroom," the boy said, running into the second grade room. As they waited, Richard noticed something different about Noah. He wasn't wearing his hat. His hair had grown back completely, with no trace of the condition that had troubled him months before. "I see you don't need the hat anymore," he remarked gently when the boy returned with his book. Noah ran a hand through his hair, smiling. "Yeah, the doctor said I'm all better. I don't have to hide anymore." "I'm really glad to hear that." Noah hesitated for a moment, as if considering something important. "But I still bring it with me sometimes," he confessed, opening his backpack to show the carefully folded gray hat inside. "To remind me." "Remind you of what?" Richard asked, genuinely curious. "That sometimes bad things can turn into good things." Noah zipped up his backpack. "Like what happened with us." Before Richard could respond, the boy quickly said goodbye and ran to catch up with Mrs. Margaret, who was already waiting by the door. The teacher stood still for a moment, deeply touched by the simple yet profound wisdom of that extraordinary child. The next morning, Horizon Academy was alive with celebration. The courtyard had been colorfully decorated for the closing event, with students' artwork displayed in every corner, representing the diversity of experiences and perspectives within the school community. Barbara opened the ceremony with an emotional speech about the transformative journey the school had undergone. Then, students took the stage, singing, dancing, reciting poetry, always emphasizing the themes of acceptance and celebrating differences that had defined the school. When it was time to present the official results of the Horizon program, Richard stepped onto the stage, accompanied by Michael. Together they shared the impressive statistics: a 78% reduction in bullying cases, a 45% increase in voluntary classroom participation, and significant improvement in satisfaction indicators for both students and teachers. "But the numbers, as impressive as they are, don't tell the whole story," Richard emphasized, looking at the attentive faces before him. "The real transformation happened in the hearts and minds of each of us." It was then that Michael took the floor, surprising everyone with an announcement. "It is with great pleasure that I inform you the Progress Educational Foundation has decided to expand the Horizon program to all schools in our network." A murmur of approval spread through the audience. "Additionally, we are creating a training center for educators, which will offer free courses on inclusive education and emotional well-being for teachers across the country." Enthusiastic applause filled the courtyard. The impact of what had begun as a painful incident would now extend far beyond the walls of Horizon Academy, potentially touching thousands of lives. "And to lead this training center," Michael continued, turning to Richard with a smile, "we couldn't think of anyone more qualified than Mr. Richard Thompson." The announcement caught Richard completely off guard. He looked at Michael with genuine surprise, speechless at the unexpected proposal. No one better than someone who has lived this transformation firsthand to guide other educators along the same path, Michael explained, as the teacher stood in stunned silence. Regaining his composure, Richard turned to the audience. "Darcy, I'm deeply honored by this offer." His voice trembled slightly with emotion. "If someone had told me a year ago that I would be here today, receiving this opportunity after everything that happened, I would have thought it impossible." A respectful silence fell over the crowd as the teacher searched for the right words. "I will accept this challenge with humility and commitment," he finally continued, "knowing that my own learning journey is just beginning, and that every educator, every child we work with will have something important to teach us." Fresh applause filled the space, even more enthusiastic this time. Richard looked at the faces before him. Teachers who had once feared him now applauded him with genuine respect. Parents who had questioned his place at the school now acknowledged his contribution. Students who had seen him only as the strict teacher now smiled at him. As the applause faded, Michael made one final announcement. "To close our ceremony, we have a special surprise. Noah, can you come up here?" The boy, seated in the front row, stepped onto the stage timidly, carrying a small box wrapped in colorful paper. "Mr. Richard," he began, his voice small but clear, amplified by the microphone, "my friends and I from class wanted to give you a gift. To thank you for everything we've learned this year." Richard knelt to be at the boy's level, visibly moved by the gesture. "It's for you to wear when you start teaching the other teachers," Noah explained, handing him the box. "To remember our story." With slightly trembling hands, Richard unwrapped the box, revealing a hat, not the colorful, extravagant one Michael had given him months earlier, nor the plain gray one Noah used to wear. It was a new hat, a deep blue with a small pin on the front. Two stylized hands, one adult and one child, intertwined in a gesture of trust and connection. "We all helped pick it out," Noah said with evident pride. "Mrs. Jennifer helped. Just order it. There's a note, too." Richard found the small card tucked inside the hat. The message, written in Noah's uneven handwriting, simply said, "To remember we're equal in our humanity." The same words he had spoken to the boy months earlier, during one of their first heartfelt conversations, now returned to him, carrying an even deeper meaning. Unable to hold back his emotions, Richard gently hugged Noah, silent tears streaming down his face, no longer the face of the rigid Mr. Thompson, but of a man transformed by the power of vulnerability, empathy, and the courage to confront his own mistakes. When he finally stood up, Richard placed the blue hat on his head to the delight of the audience, who erupted into enthusiastic applause and cheers. Beside him, Michael smiled with emotion, an arm around his son's shoulders. "A new chapter," the businessman murmured, just loud enough for Richard to hear. "For all of us," the teacher agreed, feeling both exhausted and invigorated, as if he had completed a long journey only to discover another, even more meaningful one, was about to begin. In the days following the closing ceremony, news of the training center and Richard's appointment as its director spread quickly through the educational community. Invitations for lectures and interviews began pouring in, along with messages of support and curiosity from educators across the country. "I never imagined I'd become some kind of educational celebrity," Richard said, laughing in disbelief as he reviewed his packed schedule for the next semester with Barbara. "Especially over something that started with such a painful mistake," the principal added with an understanding smile. "But maybe that's exactly why your story resonates so much. We all make mistakes, Richard. Few have the courage to turn them into something so positive." In the last week before school break, Richard decided to do something special to say goodbye to the students at Horizon Academy, especially Noah's class. He organized a picnic in the school garden, with games, music, and a small symbolic ceremony. He called the Celebration of Hats. Each child was invited to decorate a paper hat representing something important about themselves, their passions, dreams, or unique traits. The results were as diverse as the children themselves. Hats adorned with stars and planets for astronomy lovers, hats with musical notes for music enthusiasts, hats with sports symbols, animals, favorite book characters. At the center of the circle formed by the children, Richard, wearing his blue hat, led a conversation about the meaning of the celebration. "When I first started teaching many years ago," he explained in terms the children could understand, "I thought all students should be the same. Wear the same clothes, speak the same way, learn at the same pace." He paused, looking at the attentive faces around him. "Now I understand that our greatest strength lies in our differences, that each of you is special precisely because you're unique." Noah, sitting beside his father, who had taken the afternoon off to attend, smiled as he adjusted his paper hat, decorated with tiny books and soccer balls, his two great passions. "Next year, I won't be teaching here anymore," Richard continued. "I'll be helping other teachers learn what you've taught me." "What we taught you?" a girl asked, genuinely surprised at the idea that children could teach an adult anything. "That rules are important," Richard replied with a smile, "but people are even more important. That sometimes what seems like a problem might just be a different way of being, and that we all deserve to be seen, heard, and valued exactly as we are." The simplicity and sincerity of those words deeply touched not just the children, but also the adults present, teachers, staff, and the few parents who had been able to attend. By the end of the celebration, as the children ran around the garden playing, Michael approached Richard. "Noah will miss you next year," he remarked, watching his son playing ball with some friends, his paper hat slightly crooked on his head. "And I'll miss him," Richard admitted. "All of them, really. Part of me wonders if I'm making the right choice by leaving the classroom." "You'll be impacting thousands of other classrooms," Michael reminded him. "Thousands of other Noahs will benefit from what you've learned here." Richard nodded, acknowledging the truth in those words. "You know what amazes me most about this whole journey," he reflected after a moment of thoughtful silence. "How a single moment can change so many lives. A thoughtless gesture, a harsh word, or—" he glanced at Noah, who was now grinning widely as he kicked the ball, "or a child's act of courage and forgiveness." "I believe they call that the butterfly effect," Michael commented, following Richard's gaze. "Small actions, big consequences." "Who would have thought a hat could have such an impact?" Richard smiled, adjusting the blue hat he rarely took off now, a personal symbol of his own transformative journey. "It wasn't the hat," Michael gently corrected. "It was what happened afterward, the choices we made, the decision to turn pain into growth." As they watched the sunset paint the New York City sky in shades of orange and pink, the two men stood in comfortable silence, bound by a shared experience that had transformed not just their individual lives, but an entire community. And at the center of that transformation was Noah, the boy who had found the courage to forgive, to share his story, to show the way to reconciliation when holding on to resentment would have been far easier. Her child who, with his natural wisdom and open heart, had taught adults hardened by life a lesson they would never forget, that behind every rule, every conflict, every difference, there are human beings seeking the same thing, to be seen, understood, and accepted in their full humanity. At that moment, watching Noah play freely, hatless, shameless, fearless, Richard knew with absolute certainty that his next professional chapter, no matter how challenging, would simply be a continuation of the journey that had begun in that classroom months before. A journey of discovery, not just about education, but about what it truly means to be human. End of story. Dear listener, your company has been invaluable on this journey of transformation and learning. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more narratives that make us reflect on empathy and humanity. What did you learn from Mr. Richard? Share with us in the comments.